17th, same state of health, same prescription. The emperor was preoccupied and thoughtful, and I was endeavoring to divine the cause of his anxiety when I saw my anatomical work half open before him. This circumstance was decisive. I had guessed rightly. Napoleon dreaded being attacked with the disease which had killed his father. He dared not avow his fears, and consulted books to obtain from them that information which he would not ask of man. I would have given the world to dissipate those vain alarms, but I had learned by experience not to promote confidential communications, and I avoided opening a discussion which would have wounded his feelings. He was silent, and having planned a botanical excursion, I was going to retire. "No," said he, "stay. I recollect what you said to me, and have a few questions to ask you. You are continually speaking of air, of the liver. What action do those two bodies exercise one upon the other? How is it that action, which is mortal here on this rock, is beneficial elsewhere?" "It is not known, sire." "How? It is not known what in an aeriform fluid wounds such or such an organ?" "No more than it is known what constitutes pestilence, what produces the difference between a pure and an impure air. Has no attempt been made to isolate that fatal principle?" "The attempt has been made, but in vain. It is too subtle, and escapes from every process science has hitherto been able to devise. But the atmosphere that surrounds an individual infected with the plague cannot offer the same element of composition as that of a healthy individual." "I should think not, but I do not believe there are many chemists who would be tempted to analyze such an atmosphere." "Why not? There is the courage of the laboratory as well as that of the field of battle. Besides, what a difference in the results! Do you not think that the glory of putting an end to this dreadful scourge, or of having attempted to do so, would counterbalance the danger of the experiment? But to return to our subject, what are the functions of the liver, its action and structure?" I explained them to him. "Very well," said he, when I had done. "Your method appears to me new and correct. You simplify the human frame, which is really complex enough not to want the superadditions of the physiologist. But whence does it arise that your doctrines are so unlike what is found in the works that exist on the subject? Is then France behindhand in that respect? Paris less advanced than Florence? Mascagni has given such an impulse to science that he has left all those who cultivate it far behind him. There are only a few men in France and Germany." "Germany? Who are they, pray? Is Doktor Frank one of them?" I shared the general opinion respecting the skill of that celebrated practitioner, and therefore immediately replied that he was a very clever man. "Clever indeed! I had a proof of his talents the last time I was at Vienna. A slight eruption had broken out on the back of my neck. It was a mere trifle, but my suite were uneasy about it and urged me to see a physician whose merit was so much extolled. I consented, and Frank was sent for. He found that I was attacked with a malignant scurvy affection, a serious complaint. I was to undergo a preparatory treatment, take medicines. In short, there was no end to all I was to do. I sent for Corvisar, and that circumstance was quite enough to revive past hopes. I was ill, in bed, mad. Everyone told his own story. I made his own conjecture. Agitation already began to manifest itself everywhere. The physician, whose uneasiness was increased by all that he heard and saw, made the utmost haste and did not stop until he got to Schönbrunn. He expected to find me dying, and his surprise was extreme when he was told that I was passing a review. I came in, and his arrival was announced to me. I laughed at his astonishment. "Well, Corvisar, what news? What is said in Paris? Do you know that they maintain here that I am very ill? I have a slight eruption and a slight pain in my head, and Doktor Frank pretends that I am laboring under a scurvy affection, which requires a long and serious treatment. What do you think about it?" I had taken off my cravat. Corvisar examined my neck. Ah, sire, to make me come from such a distance, to prescribe a blister, which the last of physicians might have done, as well as myself. Frank is dreaming. You are perfectly well. This eruption is merely the remains of a former one that was not well cured, and will not resist 4 days blistering. Corvair was right. It disappeared, as he had said, and never returned. You see, sire, said he, as he was dressing the wound for the last time, all the dreadful diseases which this German had threatened you with are reduced to this. He went to pay a visit to Frank, thanked him, not very graciously, for the rapid journey he had occasioned him, and set off again for Paris. His return calmed the agitation that had prevailed. It showed that I was not yet near my end. There's a time for everything. The emperor here changed the conversation and passed in review the intrigues which disturbed Germany. At that period, he spoke of Schill, of Dornberg, of the Queen of Prussia. The plan, he said, was vast and well conceived, but hesitation, hurry, and a want of unity prevailed in its execution. Vagrom occurred, and it became necessary to postpone the game to some future period. It was the first time I heard of these plots and intrigues, and I could neither understand their secret springs nor their ensemble. I therefore tried to turn the conversation and mention the name of Mueller. On hearing it, Napoleon expressed himself in the kindest terms respecting that celebrated man and expatiated on his talents. He was short, thin, ill-favored, and mean-looking, but this wretched exterior and the ugliest features imaginable concealed the most comprehensive mind ever possessed by man. He was introduced to the emperor after the Battle of Jena, and, being supposed to be the author of the manifesto, Napoleon addressed to him some jocular observations on the subject. "I, sire," said Mueller, "the author of the manifesto against you? Your Majesty must have a very poor opinion of me." I spent a few hours in conversation with him, added Napoleon. His views were profound and his ideas vast and elevated. I put him at the head of foreign affairs of Westphalia, but Jerome, who had placed his confidence elsewhere, superseded him and gave him a situation for which he was quite unfit. From Mueller, Napoleon proceeded to Gotha and Wieland and passed the highest encomium upon those two celebrated characters. I reminded him of the conversation he had had with the last mentioned. You've heard of it? Yes, sire, it has been circulated everywhere throughout Germany, and I took a copy of it at Frankfurt. The emperor expressed a wish to see it, and I delivered it to him. It was as follows. I had not been many minutes in the drawing room. It is Wieland who speaks. When Napoleon crossed it to come towards us, the Duchess of Weimar introduced me to him. With the usual ceremonies, he addressed himself to me in the most affable manner, uttering some flattering expressions in my praise and looking steadfastly at me at the same time. Few men have appeared to me to possess in the degree he does the faculty of reading the thoughts of another at the first glance. He immediately guessed that notwithstanding my fame, I was simple and unaffected, and as he seemed desirous of producing a favorable impression upon my mind, he had assumed a tone the best calculated to attain that end. I have never seen a man apparently more calm or milder, or who displayed less pretensions. Nothing in him betrayed the sentiment of consciousness of his power. As a great monarch, he spoke to me as an old acquaintance would speak to his equal, and what was most extraordinary for him, he conversed exclusively with me an hour and a half, to the great surprise of all present. At last, it being nearly 12 o'clock, I began to feel that it was not proper to occupy so much of his time, and I took the liberty of asking His Majesty's permission to withdraw. "We'll go," said he, in the most friendly tone. "Good night." The following are the most remarkable parts of our conversation. The tragedy that had just been represented having led us to speak of Julius Caesar. Napoleon said that he was one of the greatest men named in history, and that he would have been the greatest of all, but for the fault he committed. I was going to ask him to what fault he alluded, when, appearing to read in my eyes the question I was about to put, he added, "Caesar knew the men that were plotting to get rid of him. He, therefore, ought to have got rid of them." If Napoleon had been able to see what was then passing in my mind, he would have read that he would never be accused of committing such a fault. The emperor paused a while, pronounced a few words, and continued to read from Caesar. The conversation turned upon the Romans, and Napoleon warmly eulogized their political and military systems. The Greeks, on the contrary, did not appear to rank high in his estimation. The eternal quarrels of their petty republics, said he, were not calculated to produce anything great, whilst the Romans, on the contrary, always aimed at great things, and thus raised that colossus which traversed the world. I pleaded in favor of the fine arts and literature of the Greeks, but he treated them with contempt and said that they only served in their hands to foment dissensions. He preferred Ossian to Homer. He only relished poetry of a sublime cast, writers possessing energy and pathos, and above all, tragic poets. He spoke of Ariosto in the same terms as the Cardinal Hippolyte d'Este, not perceiving that he thereby paid me a very ungracious compliment. He seemed to have no taste for lively and humorous compositions, and in spite of the flattering affability of his manners, the thought occurred to me more than once that he appeared to be made of bronze. Napoleon had so completely divested me of all feeling of restraint that I asked him how it had happened that public worship, which he had restored in France, had not become more philosophical and more in harmony with the spirit of the times. My dear Wieland, answered he, religion is not made for philosophers. They neither believe in me nor in my priests. And as for those who do believe, it is impossible to give them or to leave them too much to the marvelous. If I were to make a religion for philosophers, it would be quite the reverse of that professed by the credulous. That is just like them, said Napoleon, as he gave me back the document, blaming, discoursing, pronouncing with that laughable assurance which characterizes these men of theory. I received priests because it was necessary to render the revolution popular, to consecrate the republic, and make them preach up those very dogmas respecting which they had alarmed the people's conscience. They had been foolishly excluded from the nation, and thus reduced to opposed doctrines which they had at first adopted. I reconciled them with those doctrines, and they desired no better. I knew besides by experience what a powerful lever they hold in their hands. It was in vain that I conquered in Italy and dispersed the armies opposed to me. The least reverse sufficed to render problematical once more what the fate of arms had decided. The Austrians would then come forward, and the Pope joined them, the former supplying troops, the latter fanaticism, and his soldiers' predictions and miracles produced an effect which staggered even our own partisans. I was much struck with the impression made upon the Bolognese by the withholding of some benedictions which were lavished on the inhabitants of Lugo, and I began to treat with the Pope. The Directory did not relish this negotiation. They wished to upset the idol and attack Naples, Genoa, and Venice, and municipalized Europe. I refused to lend myself to these extravagant plans and did not conceal it. The prestige of our power is vanishing. The enemy now reckons our numbers, said I to the president. It is indispensably necessary that you should take into consideration the situation of the army and should adopt a system calculated to ensure you friends, as well amongst the princes as amongst the people. Diminish the number of your enemies. The influence of Rome is incalculable. It was wrong to break with that power. She derives advantages from our rupture. Had I been consulted, I should have delayed the negotiation as I have delayed that of Genoa and Venice. Each thing has its turn. In the meantime, send me troops if you wish. I do not say to upset thrones, but to preserve Italy. All that was, however, so ill conducted that it was enough to excite compassion, since it had been resolved not to conclude with Rome. It was necessary at least to wait until she had fulfilled the conditions of the armistice. We should then have had the 5 millions which the Pope was paying to balance the amount of the contributions I had imposed upon him, and a part of which was already at Rimini, instead of obliging him to decide upon every article of the treaty and allowing time for the arrival at Bologna of a corps of troops, the strength of which would have been magnified by report. The whole treaty was shown to him at once, and at the moment the army was engaged in the passes of the Tyrol. This ill-advised measure was very nearly something that cost us 10 millions in supplies, and the chef d'oeuvres of Italy, which a delay of a few days would have secured to us. But I repaired these errors. I drove back the Austrians. Marie calmed the preachers whom he had excited, and we escaped from the seditions prepared against us. The emperor spoke at length about the system of conciliation which he had adopted from that moment, and of the repugnance and the obstacles opposed to him by his friends, his relations, and even his aides de camp. The following letter will give some idea of the aversion with which he was surrounded, and of all the fears and forebodings over which he had to triumph.